I'm Shahram Akbarzadeh. I'm convener of Middle East Studies Forum and Deputy Director of International for African Institute. It's lovely to have you in the same room for our Middle East conference. I remember last time we were trying to organize a conference, news hit that there's some kind of sickness going around, travel is going to be restricted, and I talked to our president and I said, look, travel is a bit risky. We don't know if the borders are going to stay open because the news is saying they might shut. So what if we not risk the conference and postpone it until we have more certainty, we know when we can do it. And they all said, yeah, that's a good idea. Let's just postpone it until we know what's happening. That was more than 2 years ago. So it's really a great pleasure to have you all in the same room. Middle East Studies Forum is based at ADI, Deakin University, and most of you will have heard that Deakin is listed for the second time as the lead institution for study of Middle East and Islamic studies. So that's a great achievement. And it rests on the amazing work that our researchers do at Deakin University in this field. Our research is very concerned with making an impact, making a difference, and that's really, that has been a guiding principle of the way we conduct our work, our research. We want to contribute and make a difference to the lives of people around us. So I don't want to bore you with a long list of activities that we have conducted over the years, but there are some really highlights that I should mention in terms of the research that's been happening, that's been conducted at Deakin University. You might have, if you follow MESF on Twitter, and if you check our website, you will know that we have recently won a major contract with a funding body in UK, ELRA, looking at research innovation in humanitarian work. And that project is run by Dr. Akbarzadeh here. We have other projects such as the one that Prof. Isakhan runs, looking at reconstruction of heritage sites that were destroyed during ISIS reign of terror. And I should also note here that Prof. Isakhan is also named as Australia's top leader in Middle East and Islamic studies for a second time as well. So we are scoring goals here. Another project that's being, we have just heard about, the news has come out only last week. Professor Ihsan Yilmaz has won an ARC grant looking at transnational, I have to remember what the title is, but it's looking at how Turkey is making connections and trying to project its influence on the Turkish community, so transnational links on diaspora communities. So all of this tells you the breadth and depth of the research that's being conducted at Deakin University. I'm really proud to be here. You know, I moved to Deakin about more than 8 years ago now. That was the best move I made in my academic career, so I'm very happy to be based here. So if you have ideas, if you have projects, if you have things you'd like to share, we're more than happy to hear your ideas and your thoughts. I think that's all I have to say. Of course, we're running the conference at a very difficult time. You all follow the news. Region is in turmoil. 3 months of revolution in Iran and extreme suppression of population and dissidents. So it is very timely for us now to actually look at the region as a whole and try to see where these developments are leading. What does the future hold for the Middle East? And with that, I'd like to invite my colleague, Dr. James Barry, who is the convener of the conference, to open this proceedings for me. James, please.
Thank you, Shahram. Isakhan, welcome to the Middle East in Transition MESF conference for 2022. I'm going to just say a few words about the theme of the conference, but before I do, I think it's important just to get some housekeeping out of the way. At the end of the keynote during morning tea, this room will split into two. And so panels, if you're part of panels 1, 3 and 5, you'll be on that side. If you're on part of panels 2, 4 and 6, you'll be on this side of the room. Just letting you know that. Of course, morning tea, afternoon tea, lunch will be served outside, and of course there are bathroom facilities out there as well. If you have any trouble, just come and get me and I'm more than happy to help you out. So, as we're gathering here today for the first face-to-face conference that we've had in more than 3 years, and a great deal has changed in the region that we all study in that period of time. And today we'll be discussing various topics from political, economic, social, cultural, and various other areas of the landscape, which has changed over the past 3 years since the pandemic began. We might also like to reflect on the state of our own area of research and how the funding landscape, the teaching opportunities, and indeed academic freedom have changed over the past 3 years. With the momentary decline in political terrorism, at least the political terrorism that threatens Europe and North American interests, we do see less interest in the Middle East, or the need to understand the Middle East coming from the government sector, the private sector, the media, and indeed the general public. I'm glad to see that many of the presentations here today will be directly challenging this complacency and showing that the Middle East is undergoing some fundamental changes that are interconnected both with our own anxieties here in Australia as well as the rest of the West, but also changes and challenges that will have global consequences in the medium to short term. There are a number of issues that I'd like to talk about, but I'll limit myself just to one main issue that I also think is important to reflect upon, given the quality of scholarship that has come together today and the different areas of research different disciplines and different areas of research that many of you have come from. We are a chain in the transmission of knowledge. Many of the fields and disciplines that we all come from either were pioneered in or have been developed out of what we now call the Middle East, or West Asia and North Africa, or fundamentally shaped by the scholastic innovations of that region, both ancient and contemporary. It might be laughable in one way to say that a place like Deakin University, which is set in the heartland, suburban heartland of eastern Melbourne, is a successor in some great centres of knowledge such as of the Middle East and North Africa. Places like the University of Baghdad, or the Academy of Gondishapur, or even al-Azhar, or the Surah and Bombadita academies. But I firmly believe that this is the case. We are changed in the transmission of that knowledge, and we should never lose sight of that. So, to begin today, we're going to have a wonderful keynote speech from a great scholar here in Australia, Professor Sarah Phillips. But before she comes up to give her presentation, I'd like to invite our own Professor Benjamin Isakhan to introduce our keynote speaker. Please welcome Ben.
Yeah, I was just going to say we should try and get rid of that thing. Looking at that guy being brutalised. Welcome everyone. A warm welcome to you all. It's great to see you all here. I'm Professor Ben Isakhan here at Deakin University, and I just wanted to add one more thing to what Shahram was saying. He was saying it's a great move in his career to come here. But we at Deakin, those of us who predate Shahram, are also very grateful to him for his leadership. Without him, this kind of conference and event wouldn't happen. So thank you very much, Shahram. You do wonderful work, and I think the crowd here is testament to the work that you do. So we're very grateful to him for all of his work. Look, it's a real honour for me to introduce Sarah Phillips to you. She probably doesn't need a lot of introduction. She's a very well-known, very well-established scholar. I've known Sarah for a very long time. I was trying to think about that a moment ago. At least 10 or 15 years. We first corresponded via email, and at that time she was in Yemen doing field work. And I think one of the things anyone who knows Sarah would admire about her work is the depth and breadth of field work that she's done over the years. Probably, of everybody I know, one of the most consistent and hard-working people in the field, consistently out there in all kinds of complex conflict environments, collecting original empirical data. But she adds to that breadth and depth of fieldwork the quality of her publications. Anybody who's even had a casual glance at the list of top journals that she's published in and exceptional books that she's published with top publishers can only but marvel at how she does it. I don't know if she sleeps with a keyboard attached to her fingers or how she manages to keep up with it all, but it's really wonderful and impressive work that she does that, as I say, is built on top of that really quality fieldwork. And that quality fieldwork is driven also by her wonderful grant success. She's held Discovery, she held a DECRA, and now she holds, arguably the most prestigious of all, which is the Future Fellowship, which I think was awarded a couple of years ago. So this is also in part the first time I've seen, any of us have seen Sarah since then, so she's also due our congratulations for that wonderful. In fact, perhaps we can do that now. For the work she does and for that Future Fellowship. So at the moment, Sarah is at the University of Sydney and she is Professor of Global Conflict and Development there, and that's where she's undertaking this Future Fellowship. And she's here today to talk to us about after al-Qa'ida and after ISIS violence in the Middle East. So without any further ado, let's give her a warm deacon welcome, Sarah Phillips.
For that extremely generous introduction. Thank you, James. Thank you, Shahram. Thank you to Deakin University for this invitation to come and speak to you all today. Is there a clicker for me to do?
There should be, but you can probably just use the mouse. Yeah.
So today, what I want to explore is the implications of something that I think is quite overlooked about violent extremist groups in the Middle East, and that is that they are widely seen as relatively mundane offshoots of state power by the people who live in the areas that are most affected by them. And this cartoon, gruesome though it is intended to give a little bit of an indication of that. It's fairly self-evident. It's by one of my favourite Yemeni cartoonists, Samir. But you can see the Daesh, ISIS person laying injured on the table with Saudi Arabia trying to resuscitate, the Turkish government giving oxygen, and this is a very common kind of cartoon that you find in the region. The Yemenis, I think, are particularly astute at these. But what I want to do is get into why this kind of thing is so overlooked and what it might help us to understand about the contours of violence in the region. So when I referred to after al-Qa'ida, after ISIS in the title, I was referring to the fact that it feels quite likely that both have passed their high water marks, by which I mean they're reasonably unlikely to, well, they're unlikely to go away entirely, but they're also quite unlikely to govern large parcels of territory in their own names again, like ISIS did in Iraq and Syria, and like al-Qa'ida in the Arabian Peninsula did twice in the south of Yemen. And this is basically because the coalition's airstrikes make it almost impossible to organise and maintain a large network of insurgents that is sufficiently well organised to exercise control of the territory, without also omitting the kinds of signals that allow them to be targeted from the air. So the irony of al-Qa'ida, and particularly ISIS, mimicking so many of the organisational structures of the states that they were fighting, was that it gave Western security bureaucracies a reasonably conventional target. And even better, it gave them a reasonably conventional target that didn't have an air force of its own. That's not really the point that I'm here to make today. What I want to do is to suggest that focusing on the aspects of al-Qa'ida and ISIS that do emit the kinds of signals that allow them to be targeted by Western security bureaucracies only gets you so far. It can also help us to, or can also prevent us from understanding things like how ISIS and al-Qa'ida emerged and then reproduced, the kinds of violence that they helped to enable, and therefore the kinds of violence that may persist after their more tangible elements have been taken out by the coalition's buzzsaw. So with that in mind, I thought I could start with two massive questions. What is ISIS? What is al-Qa'ida? And I think that we need to go back to that fairly elementary level because you can't understand the contours of violence after ISIS and after al-Qa'ida without understanding what these groups are, beyond the elements that emit the signals that have enabled their partial destruction. So let me pull this back down to earth a little bit by offering you an anecdote. It's actually not my anecdote, it's Dr. Daniel Towers, but I'm sharing it with his permission because it had an influence on the interview questions that we asked during our recent trip to Northern Iraq together. So Dan worked for a local NGO in Northern Iraq that was helping minority communities that were under threat from the conflict in ISIS, conflict with ISIS rather, in 2016. And he stood with a commander from a paramilitary group that was defending Christian majority villages, stood with the commander sort of overlooking the front line of ISIS-controlled territory. And the commander described the conflict to Dan and said words to the effect of, look over there, there is an ISIS general. He's a Ba'athist. We fought together in the Iraqi army. I know his tactics. He's doing the same thing that the Iraqi army used to do. I'm not afraid of ISIS. And then the officer paused and said to Dan, I'm afraid of after ISIS. So when Dan told me the story about a year or so ago, my ears very much pricked up because this hits on a theme that cross-cuts a lot of my research these days. And that is basically that groups like al-Qa'ida, ISIS, al-Shabaab, the Taliban in Pakistan, are often seen as being relatively mundane by the people who live in the areas that are most affected by them. So the idea that after ISIS could be scarier than actual just over there, under the villages, that I'm here to defend ISIS, fascinates me, even if it no longer really surprises me. And this is why I think that we need to revisit that question of what al-Qa'ida and ISIS really are, even if that feels like something that we already know as a matter of common sense. And I think that this matters in the context of my wider question about how we might understand violence in the region after their decline, because this too hinges on what you think al-Qa'ida and ISIS really are, as in what they fundamentally consist of, what they are ontologically. So let me first sketch out the version of ISIS and al-Qa'ida that has basically achieved the status of common sense, I think, within English language discourses about them, and it certainly dominates the terrorism studies scholarship about them. Both of these groups are typically characterized as rebellious, as anti-establishment insurgencies that are purposeful, that are goal-oriented, and that are organizationally rational, and that have emerged through a combination of these factors here. I'm speaking in broad brushstrokes, of course, but that have emerged and expanded through their innovative use of military tactics, which includes a very sophisticated infrastructure to communicate images of its ultra-violence. They have emerged and expanded through capitalizing on Sunni disenfranchisement and by weaponizing sectarianism. They have done so through their ideological messaging, which includes an ideology that references a very narrow, particular, and of course contentious view of Islam, but one that is also radical and violently anti-establishment. And then finally, I think this dominant picture that comes out of the English language literature about these two groups really emphasizes their ability to perform the basic bureaucratic and administrative functions that are necessary in order to manage an insurgency's human, economic, political, and social resources, all while being able to maintain enough secrecy to prevent the insurgency from at least immediate annihilation. So that's, I think, the mainstream Western discourse about these groups, very broadly characterized, of course. On the other hand, I think that ISIS and al-Qa'ida are more likely to be seen by people who live in the areas that are most affected by them, in the ways that are hinted at by that gruesome cartoon that I began with, and by this one here, where it's, I don't think you need me to get into the explanation of that, it's fairly self-explanatory. But I think that there's something really fundamentally important in the discrepancy about the way that Yemenis talk about al-Qa'ida, Somalis talk about al-Shabaab, and Iraqis talk about ISIS, and the way that Westerners and the English language literature tends to talk about them. So I'm going to focus today on Yemen and Iraq, because that's where I've done most of the field work so far for this project, which has been mentioned is being funded by a future fellowship. But also because this is, you really do see in these, the way that people talk about these groups, the way that they get framed as being tools that state elites use, at least sometimes, not to challenge the established order, but to help uphold it. And I think that point bears repeating because it's kind of central to everything that I want to say today, and that is that these groups are not seen as being exclusively disruptive. They're partially disruptive, sure, but that's not all that they do. They also help to reinforce the established order. Now, these more local discourses typically discount the idea that groups like al-Qa'ida and groups like ISIS fundamentally challenge the status quo, and they instead see them as being malignant offshoots of it, or a political game, as it's often referred to, or about CSER. So, in other words, rather than being seen to have emerged and reproduced exclusively through a combination of grassroots support networks and their own robust organisational structures, this is usually the argument that comes through in, from experts writing in English, they also need state power to get to where they are. State power is a part of them. It's part of how they emerge and how they reproduce. These groups are seen as a means for states to discipline their citizens with plausible deniability. As one of my Yemeni colleagues wrote to me recently, al-Qa'ida needs state power, but state power needs al-Qa'ida to impose its control too. So he's essentially pointing to a symbiotic relationship. To give you more of an idea, because I want to get into the weeds a little bit here, another Yemeni researcher who specialises in local armed groups responded to one of my questions in an interview about al-Qaeda's seizure of the port city of Mukalla, which is about 250,000 people, by referring to a series of elite agreements. He said, I think that there is a misconception of al-Qa'ida from outside of Yemen. It could be true in Iraq or Syria, I don't know, but they say that before the cities fall there will be assassinations and that they will take over the cities using terror. What we have seen is that they haven't used these tactics much in Yemen. They've also used a series of elite agreements. Everyone in Mukalla knew that al-Qa'ida would attack. Al-Qa'ida members were even sending messages to their families in Mukalla. The authorities knew that Mukalla was under attack and they didn't make a decision to fight them. That's not just mismanagement. And he also suggested that the agreements occurred because al-Qa'ida is, quote, a useful tool for a lot of elites. These black flags are still very useful. And you can see in this cartoon, which is by a different artist, getting at the same kind of thing. So you've got one door being Abyan, the other door being Baghdad, and then the final one, Thamad, which are cities within Yemen that experienced a period of territorial control by al-Qa'ida. And then you can see the guard here, and Nidam. He's opened the doors and he's just letting them in and he's walking away with his back to them. Now, Nidam is usually translated as the regime, but I think it's also the system. And I think thinking of it in terms of the system is quite relevant for us here. It's the system that, because of what it is, turns it back and allows these things to happen. Extending the point even further, Nabil al-Qa'ida, who's a Yemeni researcher who also specialises in Islamist groups, wrote for an influential Yemeni paper that the phenomena of al-Qa'ida is gelatinous informant content and is nothing more than a political card used from time to time by international, regional and local parties. So I think he's really suggesting here that al-Qa'ida does not cooperate with elite power as an autonomous entity, but that it kind of takes the shape that elite power requires of it. So none of these statements, I've got a few more up here, you can take them as my footnotes if you like, but none of them are unusual. I've witnessed so many of these kinds of exchanges over the years, and I would argue that actually these views are so prevalent that they constitute a common sense appraisal of power politics for many Yemenis, including those who do research on these groups for a living, as the people that I've just quoted do. So I was in Yemen for nearly 4 years, and this was the impression that I carried with me for a very long time. You would have an al-Qa'ida labelled attack in the city and go around to the Gachus for the next few days or a week, and the entire nature of the conversation would be buzzing with, but who was really behind it? Yes, sure, we've called it al-Qa'ida, but was this al-Qa'ida that's affiliated with General Ali Mohsen or Ali Abdullah Saleh? There was almost never a time that I can recall where it was taken at face value that this was an independent attack done by this autonomous terrorist group called al-Qa'ida. It was always a sense that it was connected and sustained by wider groups of power. And I always felt kind of frustrated that this was almost invariably dismissed as being just another example of Yemeni or Middle Eastern conspiracism. Now, I want to be very clear that I'm not saying that it can't also be that. It can, sure. I'm just saying that it is not only that. And to see it as only that is to miss a huge part of the worlds of information that this is conveying. So after my time in Yemen, I started to spend more time in Somaliland and the Horn of Africa. Same thing. Al-Shabaab was widely spoken of as being a tool of elite manipulation. Then I went to Iraq, this time explicitly looking for this kind of thing, which I hadn't been explicitly looking out for before. It just sort of, enveloped me. Because I thought that if I could find, or if I found the same kind of thing among Iraqis talking about ISIS, a place where the extremist violent group in question actually had held very substantial parcels of territory in its own name for years, then I was probably onto something that was more transferable. This time though, at least initially, I focused on the perceptions of professional Western security analysts who were working in Iraq. And this was a bit of a long story. Basically, I didn't have any other choice. When I went, the security situation was such. It was late 2019, and I had to agree with the university that I would only stay within the green zone, which is not typically how I like to do research, but it only allows you to really talk to foreigners or to people who have been thoroughly vetted by foreigners. But regardless of all of that, I spent over a week in the green zone talking to, observing private security analysts, going about their business, analysing the very granular day-to-day details of the operational threats that were posed by ISIS every day across the country. And what fascinated me was how openly these kinds of people held really similar views to the ones that I've just sketched out up here. Really similar views to the ones that I encountered from Yemenis and from Somalis. So the analysts with whom I spent the most time in Baghdad and who have been based there for nearly a decade and who, for the record, I think is extremely astute, responded to one of my questions about the relationship between ISIS and various state actors by saying, I'm going to quote him, everyone here knows that the PMU, which is the Popular Mobilization Force, the Hashid al-Sha'bi, the PMU is using ISIS, and so are the Israelis. The Kurds also use ISIS. I mean, this is just taken for granted. We know this, but the Western analysts don't write it down for reasons of personal or corporate interest. We don't want to sound like conspiracy theorists. You should ask the other analysts that you interview, what are 2 things that you know to be true about ISIS, but that you can't or don't write down? We just don't grapple with these issues because we don't know how to talk about them. So to give you a sense of the kinds of answers that I got when I did start to ask this question, I'll give you one from a guy that I interviewed with Dan in Erbil quite recently, who said, by its nature, there is no evidence of collaboration between ISIS and state actors, but what are you looking for? It's inherently circumstantial, but there's never much doubt. You're getting to the point of being excited about being able to prove that water boils at 100 degrees. And then we asked, so do you write about these kinds of connections in your own work? And he said, not really. We are very operational. we're looking at what the targets are or whether or not they're hitting NGOs. I might point it out verbally, but because we want to have an operational edge, we don't want to burn capital and anger host governments. And these things are all very well known anyway, so it's kind of off topic. I'll say it to people behind the scenes, but if I talk to the US or the Australian governments, I think that people would just shrug. So for me, this really begs the question of why is something that is so widely discussed, something that is taken as common sense knowledge about ISIS, something that is held up as being too obvious to even bother writing down by the people who write about the threat that is posed by ISIS professionally every day. Why does this so rarely make it into the substantive literature about ISIS and al-Qa'ida? Why are they, with so few exceptions, there are exceptions, let me be very clear, there are a few exceptions, but not many. So why are they almost always characterised as being organisationally rational disruptors and almost never seen as also being manipulated or malleable by state power? And I think that part of the answer is a simple one. People in these positions don't write it down. But I think that if we want to understand the reasons why people in those sorts of positions may not write it down, then we need to ask why they don't. And for me, from what people told me, and this research is ongoing, this is very much work in progress that I'm here talking about today, it seems that much of the reason is that focusing on these things doesn't help to produce actionable information. On the contrary, it risks angering those that permit them to achieve their organisational objectives. So it actually inhibits the production of actionable information. So while the analysts that I've spoken to seem to believe that ISIS was being used by state actors, whether actively or through states' willful ignorance, they also believed that saying so explicitly, directly, on the page, would only get in the way of the job that they were there to do. And so was not really relevant to their ability to perform those jobs. These were two separate things. And they would say things like, you know, no matter what was going on behind the scenes, a bomb is still a bomb. I'm here to do my job. If you say something like this, you make it impossible to do your job. They're not precise quotes, but you know, these are phrases that we heard on multiple occasions from different people, so I put them all together. So in other words, there's a suggestion that it is not productive to dwell on these other issues because they don't help with the immediate task at hand of trying to preempt and so prevent ISIS attacks. So let's go back to the officer in the anti-ISIS paramilitary unit that Dan spoke to. Why was the officer afraid of after ISIS, even while ISIS held ground just kilometres away from him? And I suggest, at least at this stage of the research, that it's probably because he believed that ISIS is something that reflects deeper power struggles, and that those power struggles tend to involve entrenched elites, the power of whom is underpinned by the status that is granted to state actors within the international system. And that after ISIS is defeated, this is still going to be the case, except that these elites will have already used the fight against ISIS to gain other tactical advantages. To give you just an example of this, we spoke to a Western NGO worker who was working to clear out the remnants of war from the disputed territories of northern Iraq. And I'll read you this quote in some length as well, because I think it really helps us to get into the granular details here. He said, "There are towns that we've gone into that were just bulldozed. I'm talking 100 houses that were just levelled, turned into rubble, but in places where there'd been no fighting. There were no explosives, just these levelled towns. There's a bit of a scorched earth policy on both sides. It tends to get attributed to the conflict with ISIS, but they've been reduced to rubble, which isn't the result of the conflict. It was after, and it's easy to tell the difference. We just have to ignore most of this. We have to do our job. We have to get through the corridor to clear the target so we can move on to the next one." And we asked him, "How do you navigate this in the course of your work?" And he said, "We don't talk about it." So what does this mean for wider patterns of violence in the region. I think it means a lot, and many of them I'm still working through myself, but I think that it means that as ISIS and al-Qa'ida recede from their apparent high water marks, we believe that Western counterterrorism efforts against them were broadly effective. And they were, kind of. They were broadly effective against the mainstream version of these groups that I sketched out initially. You know, the organisationally rational, violent non-state actors that were seeking to replace the established order. But destroying these versions of ISIS and al-Qa'ida may have also helped to enable quieter kinds of violence that are not labelled terrorism, the kinds that Dan is going to talk about later today in his presentation. But just to sort of foreshadow that a little bit, I'm talking about the things that the NGO worker just mentioned here, the levelling of towns, the seizure of land, the expulsion or voluntary migration of communities. And I think this one is really important because we're seeing it across the region, the expansion of paramilitary forces with external backing. So in both Yemen and Iraq, this expansion has been into the very heart of the state's governing and security apparatuses. I think that the situation in Yemen may offer us a further glimpse, just a little more down the line. So in mainstream understandings there, al-Qa'ida in the Arabian Peninsula, that is the group that is based in Yemen, was splintered by drone strikes and as a result became much more vulnerable to being instrumentalized by warring parties. You know, as a result, they became more factionalized, more spread out, more criminal, and less capable of administering territory, and also less capable of conducting attacks abroad. I don't disagree with that, other than to say that this is what Yemeni discourses, the ones that I sketched out before, have always said that al-Qa'ida was. Within the way that Yemenis talk about them, al-Qa'ida was always something, always a tool, if you like, that could be instrumentalized by factional powers, by factional groups within the regime. So let me conclude with some brief implications from this for the region. And I think that one of the big ones is that counterterrorism does not necessarily lead to the things that we hope that it will. Things like the eradication or minimisation of violence against civilians. It does not necessarily lead to the use of violence in order to terrify civilians. And neither does it necessarily lead to the end of people using violence as a means of communicating a message to civilians. So you know, the usual definition of terrorism being these three things, that it is used to terrify civilians, that it is used to gain political effect by targeting civilians, and that the use of this violence communicates a message. I think that all violence does that, but that's getting a little bit beside the point. I think, though, that counter-terrorism practices can be seen to also help to organise and structure the forms that violence against civilians takes. So keeping with Yemen for just a moment, this means that al-Qa'ida may have become something other than what it once appeared to be to most Western observers. Again, I mean, the violent non-state actor that organised itself to achieve the goal of replacing the established state order. And yet, thousands of men who my Yemeni friends and interlocutors refer to still as al-Qa'ida have been absorbed or recruited into the various militias that are backed by the wealthy neighbours and that are now spread throughout the country, and that now involve far more people than al-Qa'ida likely did at its peak. They're being well trained, they're being given weapons, and they have a modicum of international legitimacy. So in other words, there remains a violent and intolerant entity in Yemen that is evolving and reproducing through its connections to internationally sanctioned structures of power, whether Yemeni state-affiliated elites, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, or their Western counterparts. Now I suspect that this may have been what the paramilitary commander was getting at when he told Dan that he was not afraid of ISIS, but that he was afraid of after ISIS. After ISIS, you have the towns that were levelled, the populations that don't return, and the externally supported paramilitary forces that once fought ISIS, that are entrenched within the core functions of the political, the security, and the economic apparatus. Perhaps ISIS seemed easier to him, or at least more tangible. It was just over there. After ISIS is messy, and in its place are the state-sponsored forces that defeated ISIS and that are now going to be very, very difficult to dislodge. After ISIS, the violence isn't called terrorism, and it doesn't really make the international headlines. But after ISIS and after al-Qa'ida, power is being consolidated into the hands of authoritarian paramilitary forces that have the backing of either the most powerful neighbours, or the United States and its Western allies, or both. After ISIS and after al-Qa'ida, there is a technologically sophisticated, coercive and surveillance apparatus that has been further refined in war, and now protest is even more difficult, more dangerous, more perilous than ever before. The Yemenis, Somalis and Iraqis that I've spoken to over the years were, I think, essentially warning of this. The way that they spoke of al-Qa'ida, Shabab, ISIS, warned that violence labelled as terrorism is likely to help to enforce state power rather than it is to upend it precisely because of the forms of international or external intervention that it tends to trigger, which supports authoritarian power in the name of stability. So let me just finish by saying that I think that this is why talking about this feels too hard or even unhelpful to the Western analysts that I've spoken to. It doesn't provide actionable targets. What do you do with this information? It's easier to think of al-Qa'ida and ISIS as being simply disruptive than also being implicated in the maintenance of authoritarian state power in the Middle East and across the global south more broadly. And with either the active or implicit support of Western states. I apologise for leaving you on that miserable note, especially for the opening presentation. But I think that I hope that thinking about bringing the ways in which these groups are talked about in the areas that are most affected by them will help us to think about what they are in a much wider context. Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, I guess so. We have quite a bit of time, so I'm happy to open the floor for questions.
Just a quick question, if I may. Oh, sorry.
No, that's okay.
About conspiracy theories. I know when you go to the region, you hear all sorts of stories. And there's a bit of truth in them, a bit of fiction in them, and it's very difficult to disentangle fiction from truth. So where does that come into this picture? I know you touched on it, and I suspect that when you heard these accounts, you might have felt this is all conspiracy theory, but I wonder if you could reflect on that aspect.
It's a really important question. And on the one hand, I kind of don't care where the truth is. What I'm interested in, I mean I do, but I can't get to that, right? I don't have the capacity of an intelligence agency to figure out precisely who may or may not be facilitating which actions. I'm never going to get to that. What I'm interested in is the way that this conceptualizes power in the region and what power does and the sorts of connections that power is able to maintain. One of the things that Dan and I asked pretty much everyone we interviewed on this last trip is, you know, what do you think about these connections is conspiracy and what do you think is real? And the sorts of answers that we tended to get back were, well, of course it's not a conspiracy, you know, just look around you, this is so obvious. And then you would ask them which state actors you think were involved, and of course you would get a different answer from almost everyone. I mean, there was obvious crossovers, but the sense was that this is so obvious that you don't, like, why are you even asking this question? This is a silly topic that you have chosen, which I find really fascinating because it doesn't appear in literature. And so what I've tried to do is to get beyond which bits are true, which bits are conspiracy, because I'm never really going to be able to grab that with both hands. What I'm interested in is the broader way in which it sketches out power politics in the world, because that's where I think the real insights from this comes from. But yeah, I'm not going to be able to pinpoint, well, that's it. I mean, sometimes you can pinpoint the conspiracies, the really outlandish ones, but generally, you know, they're powerful narratives because they do come from a kernel of truth, a kernel of misunderstanding, and then they can get extrapolated out more widely. But I think that overall, the picture of state power either actively facilitating or being willfully ignorant of, or turning its back to and letting all these things happen in the background is quite a compelling one.
Thanks.
Yes.
Just a short question. Thanks a lot, it's wonderful. And I'm wondering, how do you define after ISS and al-Qa'ida? Are we already in the after al-Qa'ida and ISS, or you're still waiting for that to come? Or?
Look, this is shorthand. What I mean is the period after their major territorial defeat, you know, when they are no longer capable of holding large parcels of land. And I was trying to be quite careful in my language about high water marks, you know, so I don't think that these groups are going away, and some people certainly think that we will see a resurgence. I think that it's unlikely that we're going to see the kinds of territorial control that we saw previously. But I don't think it's a linear, we are in the after ISIS mode and now everything is different. No, there's a lot of continuities between the two. But what I'm trying to sort of get at, I guess, is the ways in which the forms of violence that are practiced, you know, during ISIS and afterwards have a lot of similarities that tend not to make it into the international community's consciousness because the violence is not labelled as terrorism. So we don't see it in the same way. But to many of the people on the ground, it feels very similar.
I have a kind of a cheeky question.
Right.
I mean, it's a great presentation. It's opened up a lot of questions in my head. But I was wondering just if it's something that you've covered in the overall study. So when the description of they are part of the elite, they have been supported by the citizens, that distancing from those people who seem to be alien to the land, they've just been brought up by these elites or external powers, it kind of feeds that narrative, which I'll give you an analogy of the Lebanese civil war. It's always been described as it's you know, everybody's war in Lebanon.
al-Qa'ida.
Exactly.
The big conspiracy.
So did you feel that it's creating this sense of that these groups are alien to the land, and it kind of shies away the grievances that those groups could have internally in Yemen and Somalia, etc.?
I found that people were very capable of talking about both things at the same time. You know, they would talk to you about the kinds of grievances that fuel these groups. Like, it wasn't an either-or proposition in most of the people that I spoke to. In fact, I would say pretty much across the board. They were able to hold that both of these things can be true at the same time. That there are these, you know, really powerful grievances against communities that have been marginalised and people who don't have rights. And you know, this is the immediate reason that something like this, you know, it's the oxygen, but it doesn't take off unless you have the powerful entities in the region or the world being willing to, at the very least, look the other way. So, yeah, I would say that both are typically seen as being true at the same time, and it's not seen as being a contradiction.
Any questions? James?
Yeah, very insightful presentation. Thank you, Sarah. When you were talking about the terrorist organisations being tools of state power, being seen as tools for state power, it also made me think that about how conspiracies themselves, or the belief in conspiracy amongst many people, is also a tool of state power in many cases. I was wondering if you have really looked at those intersections, or if you could speak to that a little bit.
You can look to the intersections about how conspiracy theories.
How the media, like for example, in most Middle Eastern countries, often presents conspiracies as legitimate, particularly I know with ISIS. I was in the region during ISIS's period, and everyone was responsible for ISIS, from Israel to everyone else. So, and that was something that was genuinely believed. So you have the perception that people have, which is based on the fact that they live in a society where conspiracies do occur, no question, that there are these other groups behind it, but also these sort of state power does get an advantage with these groups, but also at the same time, there's an advantage in the perception that this is the case as well.
Yep. Look, I guess that's why I'm not trying to get to a level of truth about who might actually be behind it and whether or not this theory is true and that theory is not. I am interested in what these beliefs, rumours do, and I think that what they do is that they help to give people a tangible sense of the ways in which power operates. And I think that there is, because some of these theories are pretty outlandish, there is a tendency to dismiss them all as just being conspiracy, which I think is what Miriam might have been getting at as well. And I just think that that's babies in bathwaters. I think there's, trying to get to the kernel, the nugget of truth is probably not a productive way to go. But I want to look at what the function of these ideas are. And I think the function is to get you to think about the ways in which violence operates and is facilitated by state power, which tends not to be part of the way that we understand terrorist groups to function. They are seen as being entirely anti-status quo, entirely organisationally rational and seeking to upend everything. Whereas if you sort of take what I think in the broader sense these theories are asking us to look at is the idea that perhaps they are not entirely so. And what does our understandings of terrorism, but also counter-terrorism, do? Or what happens to our understandings if we take that insight into account? I think that really shifts the way that we need to understand what counter-terrorism does. But I'm afraid I cannot, and I'm really not trying to get to the level of capital T truth in what any of these theories are. I want to know what they do.
Thanks, Ben. It's a great presentation, Sarah. I mean, I'm totally sold on your idea. And I guess maybe you're sort of getting to this, and I wonder if there's a larger point to be made about how states deal with anything, whether it be problems or threats or policies about anything, is that they can only deal with things that come to them in a way that they can understand bureaucratically. I mean, just on a side note from Syria, like I remember when the regime and Russia were making reconciliation agreements with certain groups, like they tried to very much pigeonhole them and to almost like turn them into institutions or security structures that they could understand, so that they could work with them in a way that worked with their administrative and bureaucratic structures. And so I wonder if that's like almost the like macro level view of just this idea about terrorism you're getting with ISIS and al-Qa'ida, but I mean writ large really the way states deal with problems.
I would really love it if you were one of the reviewers of the piece that I it's about, because it's about exactly that, this idea that states operate through a bureaucratic infrastructure. Their hierarchies, they're organisationally rational, or at least that's how they see themselves. There's a lot of stuff that goes on in the murk of that, of course. But they tend, for that reason, to want to engage with states or with entities that are also organisationally rational and that function bureaucratically. And I think that is why there is, or that is part of the reason that there is such, I would say almost an obsession within the ISIS or al-Qa'ida literature about pinpointing the organisational structures and this sort of, wow, they really are, they're like a state, they collect garbage, they have ministries, they do all of this sort of functional administrative work. And I think that gets seized upon because that's something that Western security bureaucracies know how to recognise and know how to detect and also can destroy, which is sort of what I was getting at the beginning, that these are things that emit signals that bureaucracies are trained and equipped to detect and so destroy. And so we tend to get this image of groups like al-Qa'ida and ISIS being these organisationally rational entities that we know how to engage with. We just need to map what it is that they do, map their ideologies, map their networks, map the ways in which they access resources, map the ways in which they recruit, and then we've got almost a blueprint for their destruction. And that's where I think the counter-terrorism practices were reasonably effective. Like they were quite good at getting rid of that layer of what these groups are. But I think that beneath that, what these groups also are, is they help to enable these forms of the other forms of violence that we tend not to see when we are just looking at these, for bureaucratic signals, if you like. But I think that's, I think that's a huge issue. States are very good at engaging with other states. That's what they do. Bureaucracies deal with other bureaucracies. Diplomats deal with other diplomats. The other stuff, as the Western security analysts were saying, like, talking about that doesn't get us anywhere. We're here to do a job, and that job is to preempt and prevent an attack that could happen on Monday. So it keeps the focus very immediate, but it tends to help us do it. It obfuscates these other issues that are also deeply implicated in what these groups are, how they emerge, and how they reproduce.
I saw another hand.
Yeah, sure.
Yep.
I think your last response might have got to what I wanted to tease out with you. But what I found really fascinating in your talk was the sense that there are perhaps these two different, we might call them narrative ecologies at work, right? One is the tendency towards conspiracy and ascribing agency to organisations that we might not know much about, by people on the ground. And the other seem to be the sort of the narrative ecology of security studies, which makes its own conceptual fallacies. And I wondered if you could talk more about that. Is it because the security studies literature is sort of too embedded with the logic of Western state power, that it's unable to see these types of connections, this gelatinousness, this ways in which local elites might be interacting with these groups in other ways?
I think you've hit the nail on the head. You've sort of got these two ways of seeing what these groups are, and there's not a lot of connection between them. But to go back to the point that I sort of finished on about Yemen, and there is this very widespread view that al-Qa'ida was very successfully decimated there with the drone strikes. Like, they've taken out pretty much every capable leader, and they're left with people who are less charismatic, less good at administering an insurgency. They've had to stop using anything that can emit a signal that can be detected. I'm really good at that. But what you've got is the group taking on a different form. And I think that by only looking for those, the forms of this entity that fit within, as you very nicely put it, the narrative ecology of security studies, you miss what's going on underneath it and the ways in which this entity, which doesn't look exactly the same, is continuing to evolve. And I think from a Yemeni perspective, there's a lot of continuity between that stuff that's going on that lower level. And I suspect that a lot of the security studies literature is missing and will continue to miss what's going on below the surface, only slightly below the surface. It's very apparent when you're in the region. And the effect of it is to help to reinforce authoritarian power, to help to enforce the plausible deniability, enforce violence against civilians that is used with plausible or enacted with plausible deniability. We don't have the concepts or the concepts that we use within the security studies literature to detect that.
Hi, Sarah, thank you so much for your presentation, and I think I've just gained a fascination for this after ISIS question as well, so thank you for that, despite the conclusions. But I want to ask a question about the fear on the ground of this after ISIS question. Does that stem primarily from any conflict, or these conflicts that are obviously already there, transitioning from what the rest of the world, what these neighbours see as an illegitimate conflict with illegitimate actors, to being the tools of what are familiar to geopolitics and kind of Western state power? Or is it something else? Is it this fear that it's transitioning into something that the world is going to give a pass to? Or is there another factor that a lot of people on the ground in Yemen are really afraid of?
I think it's partly that it's transitioning into something that the international community doesn't know how to deal with, doesn't really want to deal with, and will tend not to see as something that needs to be dealt with because that's a local issue. This isn't an international issue, we can walk away. But then I think it really depends on which communities you're talking about. So Dan's going to talk about minority communities in Northern Iraq. They're affected very differently to Shia communities. They're affected very differently to Sunni. It really then depends which specific group you're talking about, how they see the ways in which this is likely to move forward. But I think the common point between them, which is where I was trying to get to, is this fear that violence isn't going away. Violence against civilians isn't going away. It's not being delegitimized. It's just being sort of morphed or pushed, if you like, into more insidious, difficult to detect forms.
Thanks, Sarah, for this fantastic presentation. I have a different question, not related to the content, but related to your field work. So as a scholar dealing with sensitive questions, working in difficult settings, how do you overcome challenges as a researcher? So I would like to hear more about how you conducted your field work, the connections you built. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, that's a really important question that I think is something that pretty much all of us are dealing with now as access becomes even more limited as a result of conflict and the pandemic. I've been lucky, I think, on the Yemen side, because I spent so long there over such a long period of time that I'm more of a known entity in a way, and so people, they can know what I've produced in the past and whether or not they wish to engage with me. But I think it's very important to always offer anonymity. That's been, and then people tend to be very willing to speak. I mean, keep in mind that these sorts of views within the countries that I'm talking about, these are not things that are whispered. These are shouted from the hilltops. These are not quiet narratives at all. This is the way that people speak about politics. So I remember one of the people that Dan and I spoke to, asking, which of these things do you think are true? And he was just like, it's all so obvious. Like, just not understanding why this would even be a topic worth engaging with because it is so out in the open. So I'm not dealing with issues that are personally sensitive. I don't want to discuss things that are traumatic with people who have experienced trauma. And in the recent trip that Dan and I did, we were very careful to be explicit about that and to say we don't want to talk about anything that happened personally to you. You of course have to be very clear that about what it is that you want to do, and that nobody's under any obligation whatsoever to share anything. But I also tend to talk to people who are in positions that are analysing these groups anyway, because what I'm trying to understand is how these groups are understood by analysts, by people who are in positions of producing knowledge that is disseminated. So that makes it a bit less sensitive. It would be very different if I was wanting to go and interview people who had been personally affected by the violence of ISIS and ask them what that was like. And I don't want to do that. I'm not trained to do that. It's not what the project is about. So I think you can navigate those sorts of sensitivities a bit, but of course, you always have to pull back if you're hitting something that's too sensitive for someone to talk about. That's not at all what I want to do. But it is a very important issue that I think we all need to reflect and re-reflect on as we do work in these areas that have been traumatized.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you for your inspiring talk. I think that beyond the conspiracy concerns, there is a lot of empirical data, only it's very sensitive, as you say. So, for example, for Turkey, there is a lot of hard data. Yeah. But my question, we should probably open also the historical dimension. The phenomenon of co-optation of any strong violent group is a phenomenon that we know for centuries in the Ottoman Empire. So it is, I would rather not see the creation of this group as state-sponsored, but afterwards the co-optation and the domestication, that's a pattern, I would say, a standard pattern of Ottoman and post-Ottoman So
And
there is
colonial
a
politics too.
continuity. But on the same time, I agree with the philosophy of our conference that there are new dimensions now since the 2000s.
I agree completely. Like to people that we spoke to, like another common comment that we would get back is, so what's new? I mean, we've been seeing this kind of thing happen through the Ottoman times, through the colonial period, like this is how power works. It's just that we tend in the West to see terrorism as a somehow exceptional form of violence, something that is somehow different from other forms of violence. But as I was trying to hint at the end, I don't see what it is, and I think people on the ground do not really see what is substantively different about this form of violence to the one that that has been experienced over centuries previously. And I think there is that continuity that these more local discourses pick up, that sort of an almost "'twas ever thus."
Yeah, well, thanks, Sarah. Just a question about the elites and the different elites that may be involved in sponsoring these groups, or that people accuse or theorise. I mean, is there not a tension if it's the state elite, whether it's the Iraqi elite, they're using ISIS or al-Qa'ida or ISIS in Iraq as a tool to achieve those own ends, but then also external actors are as well, whether it's Qatar or Saudi Arabia. And then I wonder also, is there some thinking amongst people on the ground that it's actually also Western elites, or it's the US doing this? Because to touch on an earlier point, my interest is in the Kurds, and a lot of Turks say ISIS was created by America so that PKK could be empowered and therefore expand their footprint, etc. So is there thinking in Yemen and northern Iraq that there's Western elites behind these groups as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's one of the, you'll hear all of the neighbours mentioned, Iran, Turkey, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, the US, occasionally the British, but usually all the Western states kind of get lumped in as being the US. The Israelis, of course. Yeah, I mean, it's a smorgasbord, right, of different big hands or invisible hands behind this that you can choose from. Some, there being more tangible evidence, as you were referencing, than others. But again, the question that for me comes back to what does this do? What is the broader image of how these groups evolve and reproduce that is being indicated by these theories? It's less important to me which actual group or entity is involved. But you can shooting fish in a barrel, finding different state and malign actors that are involved in these theories. But I think going down that path it's a pathway to nowhere.
Another small question is that how these perceptions are used or misused by the state actors? Because that's another dimension as well. Maybe it is fueled by those state actors as well against each other.
Yes, it is. Yeah, it's become something that is very weaponized, and you really see it in Yemen. Now it's gotten to the point where there was probably about 5 years or so ago now, one of the Houthi commanders put out a statement saying, "Can you stop blaming everything on al-Qa'ida? It's not al-Qa'ida. Not every government actor is al-Qa'ida." So it has sort of gotten to the point of ridiculousness in some ways, that al-Qa'ida has come to mean everything and nothing because it is used as a label for your enemy, for the person that you are fighting in this war, and sort of the actual meaning of what it is disintegrates. I spoke to one person who I would just say knows al-Qa'ida in Yemen extremely well, and I asked him what he thought al-Qa'ida's leadership felt about these narratives, and he was basically like, yeah, I mean, they know about it, it irritates them, they don't know what to do about it, but, what are they going to do? Like, so this is something that al-Qa'ida also talks about, the fact that it's hard for them to be seen as being independent of state power because of these narratives, but they also don't know what to do about it. It's just so prevalent. So the term becomes almost a meaningless one of al-Qa'ida. And again, that's kind of the reason that I've chosen this as my method for trying to understand what these groups are and what they do, how they reproduce, how they evolve. Because trying to gain traction through the ways that the label is used specifically, you know, who it's being attached to, it almost doesn't matter. You know, that's the substance that you cannot grasp. So I'm trying to get a sense for what it does on the ground, why it matters.
So we're right on time. Do you want to take another question?
There's one here.
Yes, I know that. Do you want to move to morning tea or another question?
Morning tea is good.
Morning tea. All right, we're going to keep the program on schedule. I'm sorry to be cutting you off there, but I'm sure Sarah's here for the day, so I'm sure she's happy to take further questions over the morning tea. Thanks everyone. We've got about half an hour, and please join me in thanking Sarah for